Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at LikeFolio. Welcome back to the show, Megan.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, so we're talking booze ahead of Constellation Brands earnings. Stock's kind of been lagging lately. Last quarter, they kind of guided a little bit lower. What kind of data are you guys seeing out of LikeFolio ahead of this report?
So whenever we look at this, I think we'll start with the big picture, and we looked at a lot of different segments that we're tracking just to see, in this macro environment, how different sectors are performing. And I think one thing that is in the positive checkbox for Constellation Brands is the fact that selling alcohol, and a lot of times we see at least consumers who are looking for these affordable luxuries, these guilty pleasures, and grabbing a beer is one of those guilty pleasures that consumers kind of lend to whenever budgets kind of get squeezed a bit. So one thing that Constellation Brands is doing really well is it's embracing luxury. I think whenever we look at just our overall mentions of what's driving the highest levels of volume, and also what's driving these net sales is their higher end brands. So you can think about things like Casanova tequila, you can think some of their higher end wines, even some of their imported beer brands have a higher price point versus some competitors. And I think that those sales accounted for 62% of net sales so far in 2023. And in 2019, this was about 34% of net sales. So they're catering to this luxury, this high-end consumer, which I think is really smart. And whenever we look at its Mexican-style beers, specifically its Modelo brand, when you think about other brands like Corona, even Pacifico, we do see continued growth in Modelo specifically among all the other brands in its portfolios that we're tracking. The only caveat I'll say is that even though demand, I think, has risen by about 22% year over year, mentions are up more than 50% year over year, but this is a slowdown versus previous growth rates. So this is, for us, we're seeing some growth in these high-end brands, but we're seeing this growth slow down. So that's a little bit of cause for concern as we head into this earnings report. And part of the reason why, even though we are recording some levels of growth in these brands, the slowdown is kind of pulling our score down a bit.
Yeah. Megan, you talk about their portfolio at Constellation Brands. It's pretty balanced, right? They've got something across just about all the categories of liquor, but 3/4 of their revenue and 80% of their profits come from beer. So this is a company, if they've consistently got double-digit growth out of the beer sector. If it slips, like I was reading, into the single digits, what does that do for Constellation Brands? Because some of your data doesn't look that great on Constellation or beer in general, unless, of course, it's Budweiser. Where's the Budweiser coming from, Megan?
I know, so that's the caveat. So we start off painting, kind of the positive picture for Constellation Brands, but then on the flip side, we are seeing a slowdown in growth, specifically amid these beer brands. And then when we look at sentiment, one of the things that Constellation Brands has talked about is it's had to increase some of its pricing to account for some rising costs on its end, and we're starting to see that impact sentiment levels overall. Those have dropped by about 5 points year over year. So this is something to watch, because previously, whenever we would come and talk to you guys, Constellation Brands typically had the highest level of sentiment versus peers, and now it's lost its edge a bit, and a lot of that has to do with the pricing power. And what that's doing is that's impacting overall levels of consumer demand. So you can see on this chart, these are people who are talking about purchasing a product with any of the companies that are charted, and you can see Constellation Brands, that demand has slipped overall by about 11% year over year, and that's really driven by that beer portfolio that you talked about. So we're just seeing signs of some losing momentum. Another thing that's a little bit concerning, especially, is heading into this first quarter. This is a name that looks a bit seasonal in our data, so we would expect an uptick as the weather looks nice, as you're sitting outside on the patio, maybe you open a Modelo while you're grilling, and we're seeing just less growth and less momentum into that first quarter. So a lot of this, last quarter, Constellation Brands said, they guided cautiously, and we're seeing that maybe this was rightfully so. So, there's a case that some of this could already be priced in, but we're not seeing any types of signs of a significant surprise. We are seeing signs of just a continued tempering in that overall consumer demand.
She paints with words, Tom.
Yeah,
Out on the deck, grilling with a beer.
I know.
It's kind of nice.
I live in Chicago right now. I need about a dozen beers after this election last night. But Megan, when you look at STZ and the happiness, I saw a little downtick in the latter stages of some of your data there. Is that a concern? Because the stock's down nearly 5% so far this year. It's kind of been whacked. It got hit on earnings last quarter just due to the guidance, but it's made up most of that ground.
Yeah, so happiness for us, that is a bit of a longer term concern moving forward. But whenever we look at qualitative mentions of what people are saying, a lot of it is related to the price point. And if you were to, let's say, I looked at this on the local, lunch spot here at LikeFolio that we like to look at. And if you go and you're ordering a beer with lunch, a Bud Light's going to cost you $4, a Modelo's going to cost you $8. And a lot of that is weighing on just your average consumer who are making these decisions, perhaps like, oh, maybe I'll go with a domestic draft versus something like a Modelo or a Corona. And so I think that this is just a near-term pressure that we'll have to watch. But I think investors probably like the concept that Constellation Brands is passing along these price increases to consumers. But for us, we're looking for signs that the consumer is feeling stress and reacting to these. And we are seeing signs of this pricing pressure that sentiment level has dropped a bit and demand is also dropping. And this differs from some of its lower cost peers. So just something to watch moving forward, and partially why our score heading into this earnings, though, we're pretty neutral. So we think that the bar is low, and perhaps rightfully so, that it tracks right in line with our data.
So did you have an earnings score? You said relatively neutral.
Yeah, our earnings score is a 1, a positive 1. So I think that that's about as neutral as we could be. But definitely long term, we'd like to see some resolution in that consumer happiness score for sure.
All right, great stuff. Great data as always. Appreciate it, Megan.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, that's Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at LikeFolio, breaking down the